So temporary total disability. And this is really an important part of the presentation because as employers, you obviously want to control your work comp premium cost. And there's really two ways to do that. One, avoid accidents in the first place through risk control and safety. But we know that's not always 100%, and it's going, some accidents are simply going to happen. The other way is to really pay attention and control temporary total disability payments on what become lost time claims. If you just pay medical out on somebody, that's a no lost time claim. The second you have to pay TTD, temporary total disability, it becomes a lost time claim. And with Wisconsin and how your modification, and I'll talk about the mod in a second, that impacts your work comp premium a lot. And this is where you're best able to control your costs, is in this area. That's the best opportunity you have. On really, really big work comp claims where someone's severely injured, at a certain point, it doesn't matter anymore. Your mod's going to be hit. No matter what you do, you're kind of done. But you still want to control it as best you can. So how do you reduce TTD payments as much as possible? Well, first thing is to have a light duty program where even though the employee may not be able to come back at their full job in terms of hours or work restrictions, there's some kind of light duty available that's within the doctor's restrictions that you can pay them for their work, and then the TTD is not paid out. Another thing is to have companies that have nurse case managers who, once somebody goes on temporary total disability, there's a nurse case manager hired by the insurance company to monitor it, work with the doctor, and try to get the employee back to work as soon as possible. Closely monitoring an employee's medical treatment is important, and you can't just hand it over and not worry about it. The employer has to take an active role in it, work with the carrier, and work with hopefully a nurse case manager and ask questions to see if they can do things to reduce those costs. And it's perfectly fine if you get some, if the employee comes in with a bunch of work restrictions and it's unclear or not defined very well, it's perfectly okay to contact the physician and say, look, we need clarification on this. We also need to know that we do have work available within these restrictions and to know that we can bring them in. So it takes a little bit. This is an area, if you're going to spend time understanding, this is the area going forward that you should do that. Because if you can lower your temporary total disability payments, it helps reduce your experience modification formula, what everybody refers to as your mod, which is a multiplier on your basic premium. If you have a higher mod, if you've had a lot of work comp claims where there's a lot of indemnity paid out, it costs you more. If you have fewer, it's lower. And in fact, our insurance puts out we have a seminar series where we really go through this in a lot of detail to explain the advantages of light duty work and controlling that mod as best you can. So temporary total disability, what are the nuts and bolts of it? Well, in Wisconsin, there's a 3-day waiting period. You don't get it on, if you get injured today and you're only out of work tomorrow, temporary total disability does not start. There's a 3-day waiting period which starts the day after the injury in the state of Wisconsin. So if I get hurt today, my 3-day waiting period starts tomorrow. And there's no temporary total disability owed for those first 3 days. However, there's a couple tricks to this. In Wisconsin, they count Saturdays. And what that means is if you're not careful and a doctor writes somebody off through Monday morning, depending on what day of the week this lands on, you sit there and goes, well, just sit through the weekend. I'll write you off until Monday. Well, suddenly what employers find out is that Saturday counts, and what they thought was once probably going to be a no lost time claim becomes a lost time claim. So those are the kind of claims you have to be very careful of and try to make sure that you make it clear to the doctor that, hey, he's only out 3 days. We never work, our company never works on Saturdays. And if he can come back on Friday, great. But don't write him off through the weekend because Saturdays count in Wisconsin. Other states go off a 5-day working week. Some states go off a 7-day working week. So every state's a little bit different in how they approach it. But that's the one that causes a lot of headaches for employers where they thought it was going to be a no loss time claim, except Saturday counts. Another thing to be careful of, if the disability or time off occurs more than 7 days after the injury, then the 3 days are paid back. So if there's a longer term period where an employee is off work, then they're paid those first 3 days, and then it's a 7 day, it's 7 days of being off. Then they get the 3 days back. It needs a doctor's excuse. You can't just pay it because he feels like it. He doesn't want to come into work for 3 days, or he or she says, well, I just don't feel like coming in. So you owe me temporary total disability. There needs to be a doctor's excuse with clear limitations and restrictions. You need to have that. You can't just not have it. And that's make it clear on the employees that if they're going to be off, they need to present that information if they expect to get any kind of benefits for that. Okay, so once we're past that 3-day waiting period, then it's what's called a lost time claim. And now you're into indemnity payments. Now you're into a wholly different type of claim where you're really paying attention to what's going on here and trying to reduce it as much as possible. TTD also includes doctor's appointments if the doctor appointment occurs during work. And it's okay that if it's possible that you tell the employee if it's possible, you need to go after work to your doctor's appointments. You can't just schedule them during the day. You could, if it's possible, you go after work. If it's not possible and they have to go to doctor's appointments during work, then they're going to get TTD for that. So how do you determine it? How do you determine what the TTD rate is, how much you pay? So step one of determining that is you have to come up with the average weekly wage that employee would expect. And that's called AWW, and there's various methods for doing this. But the two main ones in Wisconsin that you see the most commonly for determining what the average weekly wage is if it's an employee that's been there for a long time, you look over the prior 52 weeks. So from the day of the injury, you go back 52 weeks. What was the employee paid? That includes overtime, gets lumped in and then averaged out for every week. That becomes the average weekly wage for this particular claim. The other way to look at it is hourly pay rate times 40 hours a week, or what the typical is. Usually it's 40 hours. Sometimes it can be more under certain circumstances, but it's always the greater of those two methods. That's the first thing. There are some unique rules for volunteer firefighters. I don't want to get into that right now. There are a few unique rules here or there, but for the vast majority of the situations we see out there, these two methods are the way it goes. Once it's a lost time claim, it gets, again, as I said before, it has to get reported to the Department of Workforce Development. They do check those out to make sure that that average weekly wage is calculated properly. Now that's step one, determining that. And right now, in 2018, the maximum average weekly wage that the state of Wisconsin considers is $1,491. Now, once you determine what the average weekly wage is, the next step is to get the TTD rate, which is simply taking your average weekly wage times 2/3. So currently, 2018, the maximum TTD rate that gets paid would be 2/3 of that $1,441.50, which would be $994 per week, the maximum. Once that's determined, if there's an employee who's off for some period of time, that gets paid weekly. And again, DWD checks these over to verify that the correct rate is being paid. And that's why you have to report all these claims in. And again, it's important. The date of the injury determines the average weekly wage, the TTD rate, and the PPD rate for the life of the claim, whatever that is. So when does TTD end? So you have an employee who's injured. Let's say it's more severely, like they blow their shoulder out, and it's clear it's related to work, and they need surgery, and they're clearly off of TTD. When do they get off of TTD? And it could depend on the claim. And there's a couple of different things to look at and consider. The biggest thing is when do they reach their healing plateau or maximum medical improvement? And essentially, when did they return to work? If they return to work full duty after all that, TTD is done. You're not paying that anymore. Or if they return to work on a light duty basis, where maybe they're not working a full number of hours, or they're not at the same job, so they have a lower pay rate, then they get paid TPD, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. temporary partial disability. If they are unable to return to work after they reach their healing plateau, whole different analysis as to what happens. And it's PPD doesn't get assessed, permanent partial disability does not get assessed until the employee reaches their healing plateau or maximum medical improvement. Just makes sense. How can you determine what their permanent partial disability might be until they've actually completed their healing process? So that's kind of when TTD ends. It can also end if you as an employer go, well, okay, you've got some restrictions. We can accommodate those restrictions. And here, we're gonna notify you of that we have work within your restrictions, so come on back to work. And if the employee is unreasonably refuses to return and accept the accommodating work, you can cut off the TTD benefits. Do this very, very carefully. It had better be in writing, and you better try to verify receipt of that offer. There's a whole lot of things that go into that. It is something that can be done, but again, this is an area you have to learn very carefully. And again, it's an unreasonable refusal to accept accommodating work, and that may be in the eye of the administrative law judge as to what unreasonable means on the part of the employee. So everything you do to communicate a reasonable job offer works to your benefit. Another reason to cut off TTD is conviction of a crime substantially related to work. So let's say you're on TTD, you have somebody who's injured, and let's say you're a bank teller, and suddenly you're convicted of fraud or embezzlement. Well, that's pretty substantially related to work. And then you may be able to cut off TTD benefits at that point. Conviction of a crime, and you're incarcerated and unavailable to work. So maybe it's unrelated to your job. Let's say you're a factory worker and you get arrested for something like stealing a car, and you're incarcerated. Stealing the car has nothing to do with your job. However, because of your incarceration, you're unavailable to work, you may be able to cut off TTD at that point. One that comes up very rarely, but it is a possibility, is unreasonable refusal to undergo recommended treatment. If you just refuse to go for pain management or something like that, there may be an opportunity to cut off TTD benefits. However, it specifically excludes, the statute specifically excludes surgery or anesthesia. You can't force somebody to go to have anesthesia. You can't force them to have surgery. If the Department of Workforce Development, in certain cases that are litigated, if the Department of Workforce Development orders an IME and the employee refuses to go to it, they can get cut off from their TTD benefits until they comply with the IME. Now I'm going to talk about the next couple of things. The next two defenses you can have against TTD, which are brand new, well, relatively brand new. They were enacted in March of 2016. And one thing to be very careful about these have not gone through any kind of litigation in the court system. They're untested. So they're laid out here. They're possibilities. You need to be aware of them, but understand that they haven't been really tested in the court system just yet through the administrative law judges, through LERC, or into the Court of Appeals or Supreme Court. We haven't seen this play out just yet. So kind of tread carefully, but do understand them and check into them further. One is positive drug screen. And the benefits may be suspended if all of the following are true. So every one of these things need to be true if you want to cut them off from their benefits. They all have to be true. So it's step by step. So one, the employer has a written drug and alcohol policy. It has to be in writing. That policy has to be reasonable. Okay. The employee has to have knowledge of that policy prior to the positive drug screen. So you got to prove that. You have to prove that it's in writing, that it's reasonable, and the employee had knowledge. And then the employee either has to admit to use, refuse to take a test, or tested positive in a test that the employer, used by an employer in accordance with methodologies approved by the Department of Workforce Development. So there's a whole lot of steps here. And once you have those four things, and then if you fire the employee as a result of the reasonable written policy, that's why you have to fire them, you may be able to cut off those benefits. So what you see here is Be very careful. You have to go step by step. You have to meet all these criteria to be able to cut them off. One thing that in Wisconsin for the longest time has been a problem is firing people for misconduct. And I'm going to talk about misconduct in just a second. And there's this case called Breakbush where they fired a guy for showing up late, and he was on workers' comp. He was under restrictions, but he was working, and then he just showed up late too many times, and they fired him. And as a result, what ended up being in that case is they still had to pay the temporary total disability benefits, even though they had essentially fired him for cause. And they owed him all that. And that's a real problem with getting rid of employees under workers' comp. You have to be very careful and have really good reasons for it. And you may end up paying the TTD anyway. Which brings us into one of the new defenses to TTD, and this is, again, new as of March of 2016, is if you terminate an employee for misconduct or substantial fault. And what happens is the Workers' Comp Act incorporated some of the unemployment statutes definition of misconduct or substantial fault. So if you fire an employee for substantial fault or misconduct, you may be able to cut off TTD. Again, I'm going to reiterate this. This has not gone through any cases that are reported that really define what the limit is. And what it is, so if you look at the unemployment statutes, it's 108.04, you see the statute reference there. Misconduct or substantial fault are not one or more minor infractions of rules unless the infraction is repeated after the employer warns the employee. So a simple minor infraction here or there is not misconduct unless the infraction is repeated after warnings and after. So you have to go through a series. Really, it's best to go through a series of warnings and increasing penalties if you want to even have a chance of using this. It is not simply one or more inadvertent errors made by an employee. Minor errors are not going to qualify as substantial fault or misconduct. It's also not a failure of the employee to perform the work because of insufficient skill, ability, or equipment. So if the employee doesn't have the skill or the training and you fire them, that's not misconduct or substantial fault. And here's the rub on all this. A lot of employers are used to dealing with this in terms of unemployment. They know how to make these claims, and that's fine. That's how unemployment, and that's a whole other division under the Work Comp or Department of Workforce Development. Those are different judges who determine, who make decisions about those kinds of cases on the unemployment side. The problem is there's no reason the work comp judges have to follow those same rules. It gives you guidance, but is not necessarily how work comp may do it. So you may get conflicting decisions between an unemployment judge and a workers' comp judge. Hopefully that's not going to happen too much, but there is that possibility. And again, this is so relatively new, we don't know how this is going to play out. So you do have to pay attention. This is another area, keep your eye out for, kind of learn it and understand it, and hopefully we'll see how this one goes. And again, as always, be very careful with these and be very consistent. So some last things. Let's say you get off TTD and the doctor says, you know what, the employee can come back and he can do some more work, and we're going to reduce those restrictions, okay? The employee can be brought back on light duty, but is going to be paid less than he was before because he's not working as many hours. Doctor may restrict in terms of hours, may restrict in terms of the type of work, so he may be getting paid at a lower rate. Now you go from temporary total disability to temporary partial disability. So the employee is getting some wages, but not getting his full wages or her full wages. So you still owe for that difference. And I don't want to get into too much of this because Department of Workforce Development has a form called the WKC 7359. It's a calculation worksheet that that the insurance adjuster has to fill out, go through and do. It's a formula as to what's owed in those situations. So that's just another benefit. Come back to work part-time until you get back to full-time. That's how it works out. Now, if the employer has no light duty, then temporary total disability is what's going to be owed, period. If there is light duty available and the employee refuses, then the TTD may be terminated. However, again, we're subject to notification and verification notification and being consistent among employees in how you do this.